Welcome back into Live Now from Fox. I'm Austin Westfall, a live look at the White House, where it's 8:09 in the nation's capital, 5:09 on the West Coast. Let's continue our White House coverage. We just talked about the latest on the Russia-Ukraine war as it relates to the Trump administration. Now let's move over to the Middle East. Let's get the latest on the Gaza war as it relates to the current administration. It's not every day, as I said before the commercial break, it's not every day that we see Americans visit Gaza. But today it happened. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee went into the enclave, visiting a site run by the U.S. and Israel-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Here's a live look at Gaza, where it's just past 3 in the morning. I want to bring Hal Kempfer back in because, Hal, we knew that Witkoff and Huckabee were going to be making this visit. I wanted to ask you something that I asked Alone yesterday, which is, how much were these guys actually able to see within Gaza? Presumably, it's not safe for them to be brought to the areas that are struggling the most, correct?
Oh, it's not safe at all. You saw they were wearing ballistic vests, ballistic helmets. I would say, except for Steve Witkoff, he took off his helmet, and he was holding it, and he put a MAGA ball cap on. So it was a little bit of a different look that he had. But they knew that it was a high threat situation. But they were out there for hours, literally checking out the HGF, the joint U.S.-Israeli food distribution sites, and kind of getting some insight into how that's being done, and particularly some insight, not with just the distribution, but also the convoys and how they're getting the aid into those sites and stuff. So that was what they were doing today, but it was very unusual. We have not seen any Americans, certainly the U.S. ambassador and a presidential envoy in Gaza for a very long time. Well, certainly not since October 7th. This is a huge shift to see this, but it kind of tells you a little bit about the shift in dynamics too, in terms of where Gaza is going. I think it also makes a big statement that the U.S. is there on the ground with officials at this level, actually getting eyeballs on the ground, and I'm sure that will be reflected soon within some of the public statements that we're saying about our position on Gaza, particularly in light of what's been said by the prime ministers of Canada, Great Britain, and of course the president of France, and trying to find our way with this quickly evolving policy change across the international front.
We've been looking at pictures that were posted by U.S. officials. Steve Witkoff posted on Twitter, he said, "At the president's direction, Huckabee and I met yesterday with Israeli officials to discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Today, we spent over 5 hours inside Gaza, level setting the facts on the ground, assessing conditions, and meeting with agencies in the region. The purpose of the visit was to give the president a clear understanding of the humanitarian situation and help craft a plan to deliver food and medical aid to the people of Gaza." Those are Witkoff's words. My question about that is, why does the U.S. have to do this, Hal? Is Israel capable of doing this on their own?
Well, we're doing it jointly with them, and I think it's to add a little bit of international support to what's being done. Israel could do it alone, but I have to tell you, it's a very tense situation between certainly Israelis and the Palestinians. The U.S. personnel, the U.S. involvement acts as something of a mitigating factor, if you will, in terms of how those things are run. It also puts a third party in, if you will, helping to run those things. So it's not just the Israelis. Also, it helps with what's being done to provide a more neutral and maybe more authoritative explanation of how the aid is getting in there. If Israel is saying the aid's getting in there, immediately that's discounted by a large part of the international community. If the U.S. says, "Hey, look, we're making sure this amount of aid is getting in there," it's not as quickly as it's discounted by some, I'm sure, like Iran and others. But it's actually taken as a very authoritative, somewhat more of a third party voice in terms of explaining what's happening on the ground. So our presence is critical to the integrity of that particular aid approach, if you will.
Talk to us about the humanitarian conditions in Gaza. How would you describe it?
They're really bad. They're tough. I mean, it's very difficult. Just living there is tough enough. The water situation has never been great because a lot of the water that they were pumping out has been contaminated and stuff like that. Although I am hearing that there does seem to be enough potable water that's getting out to the population. Although part of that, it's kind of tough to work through all the disinformation that's put out by the Hamas side on how bad things are. There is a shortfall of food. I will say though that there was a picture in the New York Times that was circulating out showing a very emaciated child, and it turns out that that was not due to starvation. That was due to another health effect. At least that was reported. So that was somewhat deceptive that was being put out as an indication of starvation. But I think there's been enough pictures showing basically, children in need of food, lack of food sufficiency, if you will, and others that lack of food sufficiency that everybody says, look, we need to get a lot more aid in there. About 500 trucks of aid per day was before October 7th, and I think they want to get back to that 500 trucks a day. Problem is getting the aid to those who need it. It's the situation on the ground has dramatically changed. 75% of the area is controlled by the IDF now. And when trucks go in there, for example, UN trucks, they're often swarmed. And in many cases, Hamas is taking all the aid and then using it, sometimes reselling it. There are reports circulating as recently as today that there are basically warehouses or storage areas within Gaza that are full of food that Hamas controls, and they've been using that as a funding mechanism to pay for fighters and other things going on there. Also, people come in there and they just steal it, and what the problem is, it almost becomes survival of the fittest or survival of the most heavily armed. That they go in there and they steal all the aid off the truck, so the aid doesn't get to those who really need it. So that's one of the reasons that the U.S. is in there with Israel, is trying to get that aid in there much more securely, much more forcefully, if you will, to where it needs to go. Jury's out as far as whether that's really working, although the Israel and U.S. position has been that the aid convoys are getting in there more securely than they were before. So, I just have to kind of take that as it is. I don't have any way to verify that per se, but obviously a lot more aid needs to get in there.
Crushing situation. This is how Ambassador Huckabee put it on X. He says this morning, I joined the organizations that are helping with the aid in Gaza. He joined the organizations, Steve Witkoff, for a visit to Gaza to learn the truth about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's updates, aid sites. We received briefings from the IDF, he says, spoke to folks on the ground. GHF delivers more than 1 million meals a day, an incredible feat, Huckabee says. Hal, I got to move on to something else that has been discussed a lot this week. You already alluded to it. The idea of recognizing a Palestinian state. This is the first time I've talked to you since some new countries say that they're eyeballing recognizing a Palestinian state. That includes France, the UK, and Canada, as you alluded to. These countries have stipulations before they'd recognize the state. My question is, how does the current U.S. administration feel about a Palestinian state? Is it clear?
It's somewhat clear, but it seems to be evolving very quickly. I don't expect President Trump to turn around tomorrow and to parrot what was said, by Canada or certainly by the UK, that we're going to recognize them in September or something like that. President Macron of France was the first to say, hey, in September, we're going to recognize a Palestinian state. And then Keir Starmer basically said, yeah, we're probably going to do that as well. And then Carney in Canada said, yep, we're going to do it too. And I think some of that is basically in response to Netanyahu's intransigence, not even admitting that there is a humanitarian crisis or a starvation crisis, if you will, bordering on a famine. I'm not going to say it's necessarily a famine, but there is definitely food insufficiency there. That basically they just get nothing but this pushback from Netanyahu. And I think a lot of that was frustration. The Trump administration has been saying some things that indicate there's some level of frustration with Netanyahu on this, and I'm just not quite sure if we're going to see eventual a full evolution, but I never say never. I've watched what's been happening with our position with Russia and the war in Ukraine. And to say that we're in a very different position now than we were some weeks back or a couple months back would be a great understatement. I mean, there's been a very fast evolution with our policy on Russia and dealing with Putin. And I can't rule out that President Trump maybe get a little bit more frustrated with Netanyahu and Israel not being willing to make some sort of deal, if you will. And I will say this, that President Trump definitely wants to get a ceasefire and get a deal on the table in regards to Gaza. That's become very, very clear. And what I've seen over the last 6 months is when he gets this mindset like that, he puts a lot of pressure in a lot of places. So I don't know exactly what that will turn into, but I would expect to hear some language indicating putting pressure on Netanyahu to come to some sort of arrangement or some sort of deal at some point here.
Let's put this in plain English. Why does the idea of a Palestinian state, the recognition of a Palestinian state, put pressure on Israel? I think a lot of us know that it does put pressure on Israel, but why does it?
Well, let me give you an Israeli position on this. All right. One thing that I thought was really good with the Arab League and with the EU was this recent vote where they said, look, Hamas has to be disarmed. It's a big thing. Basically, what is Hamas if they're not armed? They cannot be in a governance role. I thought that was a big thing. All right. Now, of course, they're also talking about the two-state solution, that there needs to be a Palestinian state, but they're talking about the PLO. Or not the PLO, but the Palestinian Authority would take lead. Now, that's where you'd find the Israelis will say, look, the Palestinian Authority, A, is very corrupt, not very capable. They've had huge problems with the Palestinian Authority, came out of the PLO, and it wasn't that, within a lot of people's memories, the PLO was a major terrorist group. You go back, 25, 30 years, very different vision of the PLO. Certainly, if you go back before the Camp David, or not Camp David, but Camp David was involved with that. But if you want to go back 30 years ago, it was a very different understanding what the PLO was and what they're about. Well, that evolved into the Palestinian Authority. And so there's just a lack of trust. And the big fear is that if they do the two-state solution, they could end up with an October 7th or something even worse. So there's a basic security concern within Israel about setting something like that up. And they just don't have a sense of assuredness that whatever is set up, that there might be this big rush to put something in place and it would be, quickly evolve into a security nightmare, just like Hamas and Gaza did, that led to October 7th.
Hal Kempfer is a retired Marine intelligence officer, national security analyst, and the host of the Strat podcast. You can listen to it anywhere podcasts are available. Hal and I will be speaking tomorrow as well, 2 p.m. Pacific time. We don't exactly know what we're going to be covering yet. That's usually a day-by-day thing, but Hal, we'll be catching up with you tomorrow afternoon. See you.
Okay. See you, Austin.
So what we're going to do next is hit a quick commercial break. You've been looking at this live look at the White House, 8:22 in the nation's capital, 5:22 out west.